1 minute ago, Iranian cluster missiles struck the Sorak B desalination complex, the last functioning node in Israel's national water treatment and distribution network. The last one. Not a secondary facility, not a backup system operating at reduced capacity. The singular remaining facility that has been carrying the entire burden of Israel's civilian water supply since every other treatment plant in the Mekarot network was taken offline by ballistic strikes over the past 11 days. The facility that Tel Aviv's 4 million residents, every hospital still receiving patients along the coastal corridor, every emergency water distribution point that civil defense authorities had designated as the final fallback for a civilian population that has not had reliable tap water in over a week. All of it, every person, every system, every medical operation, every glass of water poured for a child in the last 72 hours, all of it depended on this one facility continuing to function. Cluster munitions, not a single penetrating warhead, not a precision strike aimed at one building within the complex. Cluster munitions designed from the moment of deployment to scatter submunitions across the full footprint of the facility simultaneously, hitting every system, every intake, every membrane, every pump, every pipe, every control panel at the same time. The last working water plant in the state of Israel is not offline. It is destroyed. And the taps that were still running 60 seconds ago are not running now. This was not an escalation. This was an extinction. The extinction of treated water as an available resource for 9 million people living inside a country that no longer possesses the infrastructure to produce it. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means, and what comes next in a sequence that no government official and no mainstream outlet is currently willing to lay out honestly. Specifically, I will show you why Iran selected cluster munitions for this specific target and why that choice transforms the damage from repairable to permanent. What the complete absence of treated water, not a reduction, not a shortage, a complete absence, means for a civilian population of 9 million people on a timeline measured in hours and days, not weeks. What Israel's hospitals, already operating on backup generators and emergency water reserves, now faced with the destruction of the last source that was keeping clinical operations viable. What the Israeli government has communicated to its own population about this strike, and more importantly, what it has refused to communicate, and why the destruction of Sorak B is not simply the most significant infrastructure strike of this conflict, but the strike that has fundamentally altered the survival calculus for every civilian inside Israel's borders. Before I get into it, thank you for being here. I mean that. Your support, your attention, your willingness to engage with analysis that does not simplify what cannot be simplified, that is what makes this possible. If you are not subscribed, subscribe now. Like this video so it reaches more people who need to understand what just happened. Now, let us get into it. To understand why the Sorak B strike is categorically different from every previous infrastructure strike in this conflict, you have to understand the weapon. And you have to understand why Iran chose this weapon for this target and no other. Every previous strike on Israel's water infrastructure used standard ballistic warheads. A ballistic warhead is a unitary explosive device. It hits one point, it detonates at one point. It produces a blast radius that radiates outward from that single point of impact, destroying what is closest, damaging what is further, and leaving what is beyond the effective radius intact or repairable. Against a large industrial facility, a water treatment plant that spans hundreds of meters of interconnected systems, a unitary warhead strike is devastating but survivable at the system level. The intake infrastructure may be destroyed, but the treatment membranes survive. The pumping station may be wrecked, but the chemical dosing systems are operational. The facility loses capacity. It loses output. But the components that survive the blast radius represent a foundation on which emergency repairs can rebuild partial functionality. That is exactly what happened at every other Mekarot facility that was struck in the preceding days. Partial destruction, partial survival, partial repair as a theoretical possibility. That is what allowed the Sorak B facility to become the last working plant. It was not untouched. It had sustained peripheral damage from earlier strikes on nearby infrastructure. But its core systems survived because they were outside the blast radius of warheads aimed at other targets. Its operators pushed those surviving systems to maximum emergency output, running desalination membranes beyond their rated capacity, bypassing damaged secondary treatment stages, pumping reduced quality but survivable water into the distribution network at volumes that kept taps running for 4 million people at a fraction of normal pressure. Imperfect, Unsustainable long-term, but functional. Water came out of taps, people drank it, hospitals used it, life continued at a degraded but livable standard. Cluster munitions do not work like that. A cluster munition is not a single warhead. It is a delivery system for dozens, in some configurations hundreds, of individual submunitions, each one an independent explosive device, dispersed across a defined target area in a pattern engineered to ensure comprehensive coverage. Against a facility the size of Sorak B, a cluster munition strike does not create one crater and one blast radius. It creates a field of simultaneous detonations distributed across the entire operational footprint of the plant. The seawater intake infrastructure, HIT, the pre-treatment screening and filtration systems that remove particulates before desalination, HIT, the high-pressure reverse osmosis membrane arrays that perform the actual molecular separation of salt from water, the most expensive, most specialized, most irreplaceable component of the entire facility, HIT, every single rack. The energy recovery devices that make the desalination process economically viable, HIT, the post-treatment remineralization and chemical dosing systems that make desalinated water safe for human consumption, HIT, the high-capacity pumping stations that push treated water into the national distribution grid, HIT, the SCADA control systems and electrical switchgear that coordinate and power every process stage simultaneously, HIT, the backup generators that were keeping the facility running after the national power grid went down, HIT, every system, every component, every connection between components, every redundancy, every backup, hit simultaneously by individual submunition detonations distributed with the specific dispersal geometry that cluster munitions are designed to achieve. This is the distinction that matters, the distinction that determines whether Israel has a water crisis or a water catastrophe, and it is the distinction that no official source has been willing to articulate clearly. A ballistic warhead against an industrial facility creates a repair problem. You identify what was destroyed within the blast radius. You source replacement components. You reconnect them to the systems that survived outside the blast radius. You restore partial output. The timeline is days to weeks, depending on component availability and engineering capacity. Difficult, but achievable. Cluster munitions against an industrial facility create a replacement problem. There is no blast radius to define. There is no area outside the damage zone where surviving components can serve as a foundation for repair. Every system has sustained simultaneous damage at multiple points. You cannot repair the intake infrastructure because the treatment systems it feeds are also destroyed. You cannot repair the treatment systems because the pumping infrastructure that moves their output is also destroyed. You cannot repair the pumping infrastructure because the control systems that coordinate it are also destroyed. You repair one node and the 6 nodes connected to it are gone. You repair those 6 nodes and the 18 nodes connected to them are gone. The facility does not have a damaged section and an intact section. It has comprehensive, simultaneous, distributed destruction across every functional system it contains. Replacing the Sorak B desalination complex does not mean repairing the Sorak B desalination complex. It means building a new desalination complex from components that are manufactured in specialized facilities in Europe and East Asia, shipped on cargo vessels across oceans, through a logistics chain that terminates at a country whose primary airport is destroyed, whose port facilities are operating under active missile threat, and whose internal transportation network is degraded by weeks of sustained strikes on road and rail infrastructure. On a timeline measured in months to years under peacetime conditions. Under current conditions, the timeline is undefined. It is not long. It is undefined. The taps are not going to come back on. Not tomorrow, not next week, not on any timeline that has meaning for the people who need water today. Now let me translate the infrastructure analysis into the human reality it produces, because the technical language of systems and components and dispersal patterns can obscure the thing that actually matters, which is what happens to people. A water shortage is a situation in which supply falls below demand. It is managed through rationing, through prioritization, through emergency distribution that allocates a reduced supply to the populations and institutions that need it most urgently. A water shortage is survivable because it presumes the existence of a supply, reduced, inadequate, but present, that management and rationing can stretch across the gap between what is available and what is needed. A water absence is a situation in which there is no supply. There is nothing to ration, there is nothing to prioritize. Emergency distribution is not stretching a reduced supply. It is attempting to conjure a supply from sources that were never designed, never scaled, never positioned to replace an entire country's water treatment infrastructure. Israel's civilian population is not experiencing a water shortage. It is experiencing a water absence. The last source is gone. The water that currently exists inside Israel is the water that was already in distribution pipes when the strike hit. The water in rooftop tanks on apartment buildings, the water in bottles and containers on supermarket shelves that were already half depleted from 11 days of hoarding. The water in whatever emergency reserves civil defense instructed citizens to stockpile at the beginning of the conflict. That water is finite. Every liter consumed is a liter that cannot be replaced from any domestic source. When it is gone, it is gone. Emergency water supply at the scale required to substitute for the treated water output of an entire national water network does not exist as a capability that any country, any military, any international organization maintains in ready reserve. Emergency water response, the kind deployed by the ICRC, by UNICEF, by WHO, by military humanitarian units, is designed to serve displaced populations of thousands to tens of thousands in localized disaster zones. It is not designed to replace the municipal water supply of a country of 9 million people. The logistics alone, the trucking, the portable purification units, the distribution infrastructure require a mobilization timeline measured in days to weeks from the moment of deployment authorization, routed through an international logistics chain that must enter a country whose airport is non-functional, whose airspace is contested, and whose port access is under active threat. The humanitarian water response is coming. The international community is mobilizing, but the timeline on which that response becomes operational and the timeline on which 9 million human bodies require water to continue functioning are not the same timeline. The human body requires approximately 2 liters of water per day to sustain basic metabolic function. In the Mediterranean summer heat that Israel is currently experiencing, that requirement increases to 3 to 4 liters, accounting for perspiration, exertion, and environmental thermal load. 9 million people requiring 3 liters per day is 27 million liters per day, every day, starting today. The international humanitarian logistics chain is not delivering 27 million liters of water to a conflict zone with no functioning airport today. It is not delivering it tomorrow. It is not delivering it the day after. The gap between when the water ran out and when the replacement supply arrives is measured in days. The human consequences that accumulate in that gap are measured in lives. The hospitals require separate attention because they represent the most concentrated, most immediate, most medically catastrophic dimension of the water absence. Israel's hospital system was already degraded before this strike, already running on backup generators since the power grid attacks, already managing reduced water pressure since the earlier Mekarot strikes, already operating at surge capacity from weeks of conflict casualties filling wards designed for peacetime patient loads. Every system was stretched. Every resource was rationed. Every clinical function was operating at the outer margin of what was sustainable. The destruction of Sorek B has removed the single input that hospital operations cannot function without at any level of emergency adaptation. Dialysis requires water of specific purity to perform the blood filtration that keeps renal failure patients alive. That water is not available. Surgical instrument sterilization requires treated water. That water is not available. Wound irrigation, the basic clinical process of cleaning injuries to prevent infection in a patient population that is overwhelmingly composed of blast and shrapnel casualties, requires clean water. That water is not available. Pharmacy compounding, IV fluid preparation, basic patient hydration, sanitation of clinical spaces to prevent nosocomial infection in overcrowded wards, every single one of these functions requires treated water that the last working water plant was providing and that no alternative source can now supply. The hospitals are not managing a shortage. They are facing a shutdown of every clinical function that depends on water, which is every clinical function. The patients inside those hospitals, the most medically vulnerable people in the country, the people who cannot relocate, cannot queue at emergency distribution points, cannot filter their own water, cannot do anything except depend on a medical system that has just lost the resource it needs most. Those patients are now in acute danger, not from Iranian missiles, but from the absence of the infrastructure those missiles destroyed. The Israeli government's public response to the destruction of Sorek B has been silence, not measured communication, not carefully worded reassurance. Silence. No official statement explaining to the civilian population what the destruction of the last water plant means for their immediate access to treated water. No updated civil defense guidance reflecting the reality that emergency water reserves can no longer be replenished from any domestic source. No honest public assessment of the restoration timeline, because an honest assessment would require admitting that there is no restoration timeline. No communication from any government ministry, any military spokesperson, any civil defense authority that addresses the fundamental question that 4 million people in Tel Aviv and 9 million people nationwide are asking right now, which is, when does the water come back? The answer is that it does not come back. Not from domestic infrastructure, not on any timeline that the biological requirements of 9 million people allow. And no one in the Israeli government is saying that. The international community is responding, but it is responding within frameworks that were not designed for this situation. The ICRC has issued an emergency declaration characterizing the cluster munitions strike on civilian water infrastructure as a potential violation of Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which prohibits the destruction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. The Convention on Cluster Munitions, which 112 nations have signed, prohibits the use of cluster munitions entirely. Iran is not a signatory. The legal frameworks exist. The enforcement mechanisms for those frameworks inside an active conflict zone do not. The United Nations Security Council is convening an emergency session. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany have issued a joint statement calling for an immediate humanitarian corridor to deliver emergency water supplies. The statements are real. The concern is genuine. But statements do not produce 27 million liters of water per day inside a country whose physical logistics infrastructure has been systematically degraded to the point where receiving and distributing that volume is itself an engineering problem that has no immediate solution. And this strike does not exist in isolation. It exists at the end of a sequence. The power grid is down. The national electricity infrastructure that powered every hospital, every water pump, every refrigeration unit, every communication system in the country has been offline for days with no restoration timeline. Ben Gurion International Airport is destroyed. The primary logistics artery connecting Israel to the international supply chain that its survival now depends on has been physically eliminated. The Dimona nuclear facility has been struck twice with damage that the Israeli government has neither confirmed nor denied in any specific detail. Tel Aviv has been hit with hypersonic missiles that produced fires across the city center. The American military presence that was providing the logistical and defensive backbone of Israel's conflict posture has withdrawn. And now the last water plant, the final piece of civilian survival infrastructure that was still functioning, has been destroyed with a weapon specifically chosen to ensure it cannot be repaired. Each of those events was a crisis. Together, they are not a series of crises. They are a collapse, not a military collapse. The IDF continues to function as a fighting force, a civilizational collapse. The progressive, systematic, and now complete destruction of the infrastructure that modern civilian life in a nation of 9 million people requires to exist. Power, water, connectivity, logistics, each gone, each destroyed in ways that prevent restoration on timelines that matter. The question that the destruction of Israel's last working water plant places at the center of this conflict is not a military question. It is not a diplomatic question. It is not a question that belongs in the category of strategic analysis that governments and think tanks and military planners are accustomed to addressing. It is a biological question. How long can 9 million people survive without the infrastructure that produces the water they need to live? The answer to that question is days, not weeks, not months, not the open-ended timelines that geopolitical conflicts are analyzed within. Days. The human body does not negotiate with infrastructure destruction timelines. It does not wait for diplomatic breakthroughs. It does not pause its metabolic requirements while logistics chains are mobilized and humanitarian corridors are negotiated and emergency sessions are convened. It requires water. It requires water today. It requires water tomorrow. And the infrastructure that provided that water is gone in a way that ensures it will not provide it again. Iran destroyed the last water plant. The taps have gone dry. And the clock that began the moment those cluster munitions detonated is not a strategic clock that analysts track on situation boards. It is a biological clock that is ticking inside the body of every single person in that country. Thank you for watching. I genuinely appreciate every single one of you who stays through to the end and engages with this work. 2 questions I want you to think about seriously. First, Iran used ballistic warheads against every previous water infrastructure target in this conflict. For Sorak B, the last facility, the one whose destruction would be permanent and total, it switched to cluster munitions. That switch required precise knowledge of the facility's internal layout, the spatial distribution of its critical systems, the specific dispersal geometry needed to ensure simultaneous coverage of every operational component. What does that weapon selection for this specific target tell you about the intelligence preparation that preceded it, and how long before the strike do you believe the decision to use cluster munitions on this facility was made? Second, at what point does a government that has lost its power grid, its water supply, its primary airport, its external military support, and any viable restoration timeline for any of them, at what point does that government owe its 9 million citizens the truth about what the biological clock they are living on actually requires them to do? And what happens to a government that refuses to answer that question until the clock runs out? Drop your answers in the comments. Subscribe if you are not. Like this video so it reaches more people. Click the video on screen to watch the next one. I will see you soon.